understand that in these sessions I'll talk for a while and then I'll lead you in a prayer exercise and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Is that right, Bruce? Yes. And at the back, on the little table at the back, you'll see some handouts and cards which are aimed at helping you with prayer either now or later. If you're finding it hard work when we do the praying a bit later on, you might like to wander around and get a card and see if that helps you. Anyway, when Father Bruce invited me to speak on how I pray, my temptation was to tell him and you that it could be summed up in one word, which is badly. I wonder if you ever think about your own prayer in those kinds of ways. I wonder if, however subconsciously, you rate your times of prayer as good or bad, successful or a failure. If you do, you wouldn't be unusual. I suspect an awful lot more of us do that than we realise, even if we only do it subconsciously. If you would rate a bad prayer time as something like wandering attention, being distracted by thoughts of anything or everything other than God, or realising you've spent nearly all the time you set aside for prayer going over and over an encounter you had with someone earlier in the day, or perhaps worrying about a problem you're facing or somebody that you're concerned about, or maybe it means feeling you haven't really connected with God at all. You're sitting in a great big void where you don't feel anything, you can't get anything from Scripture. Praying seems rather a senseless or boring activity. If you know any of those experiences, you'll know what I mean when I say I pray badly. But it wasn't always like that. When I first came to faith as a young adult at 19, I felt like the poet George Herbert describing his own early relationship with God. He says in it, there was no month but May. Everything in the garden of my prayer felt full of flowers, buds bursting into action under the sun of God's love, mercy and grace. But not so much further down the line, things began to change, and my prayer garden began to look and feel as if it had been hit by a severe frost that had killed off the buds and left everything blighted and withered. I carried on going to church, attending Bible study and prayer groups, doing my best to pray, and occasionally feeling more like I succeeded, but mostly dragging around what felt like a rather shameful secret of how far I must be from God because I couldn't pray. I longed for it to be different and connect to him again, but I couldn't find any sense to make from my experience. I mentioned the poet George Herbert, and he was one of my earliest helps because in his poetry I found someone who had a real relationship with God in which he was able to express the full extent of his feelings. Certainly joy, praise, peace and gladness, but also other things like misery, rage, pain, complaint, despair. He began to give me hope that maybe it was possible to pray and relate to God no matter how you felt. The line I quoted earlier comes from one of 5 poems he entitled Affliction, and from the fact that there are 5 of them you can guess that he wrestled a lot to understand the ways of God and to trust in his love at the times when everything in his life seemed confusing and very bleak. From him I learned what I was later to learn more fully when I began to pray regularly with the Psalms, that the best place to begin when all seems lost and God feels 100 miles away is by fully inhabiting the place where we are and owning what we really feel, then articulating it, however inarticulately, to God. We might only be able to groan aloud or maybe take a black crayon and scribble over a piece of paper. But that's the place where God can meet us. If we turn up as we imagine God would like us to be, pious and recollected, then he can't really reach us because the real person we are at that moment isn't really there, and so he might seem rather distant. It's better to come as we are, painful as that may be, and simply put ourselves in his way. Another thing that helped me further along the line was the writings of some of the Carmelite authors. What attracted me to them? I grew up in an environment where it seemed the duty of children was to be cheerful, helpful, no trouble, to work hard and to be a credit to their parents and teachers. Anything else was frowned upon or met with reproach and sometimes punished. It was hard to think that God wouldn't be the same, and despite the saving grace of my Christian conversion as a young adult, when my prayer life and sense of relationship with God seemed to have withered and died, it became hard to not to conclude that I must be in the divine doghouse, so to speak. I must have done something wrong. When I came across the writings of the Carmelite saints I've mentioned, I felt a huge sense of relief in the first instance, because they were clearly at home with darkness and confusion and didn't see it as any kind of barrier to God. On the contrary, they seemed to view it not only as a normal part of the Christian journey, but one that could be welcomed and seen in a different perspective. A perspective that can help us to see that our very failings, poverty and struggle can bring us closer to God. And by poverty here, I mean when we just feel like we've got nothing to offer God. Perhaps most vitally of all, they help me to realise that prayer and relationship with God can't be measured or evaluated by such things as our feelings of devotion or not, or how recollected and undistracted we might be when we pray. They also reminded me of what could be an embarrassingly basic and obvious truth, but one I suspect I'm not alone in sometimes finding hard to believe. That is, that God's love for us and his desire to give himself to us continues always and is never deflected or changed by how we perform, whether we perform well or what we see as shamefully badly. We can't make God love us more or less than he already does and always will. The focus of Carmelite spirituality is about being oriented towards God, being available for God, surrendering to God so that God can give us what he most longs to give us and is always giving us, and that's himself. I recently heard a Carmelite priest define Carmelite spirituality as a relationship with God experienced in and through relationship with Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate human Jesus. Our prayer happens in and through Jesus. He embodies God's unconditional and self-giving love for us at every moment. How does he do that? Forgive me if the question seems basic, but it's an important one. In Jesus, we see the whole of God, who God really is, a God who chooses to be weak and to share with us fully what we experience as humans in order to give himself to us utterly out of love, so that we might share in his life, the divine life of the Trinity. Saint Teresa of Avila, who's a fairly famous Carmelite saint that had her 500th centenary last year, says that when we pray, we must please God by going through the sacred humanity of Christ, in whom he takes his delight. Meditating on and relating to Christ's humanity is a central theme of her teaching on prayer, and she suggests that we use the humanity of Jesus, not least in his passion, to help us with our prayer and living, because he has experienced the same things as we have and suffered in the same ways as us. She says, when somebody suggested she meditated with Jesus on the on the Passion, it seemed that her own relationship with Christ took off because, she says, I saw that he was man, even though he was God, that he wasn't surprised by human weaknesses, that he understands our miserable makeup, subject to many falls. I think it's kind of an important truth for us to really realise that God chose to become weak and failing, and that he understands what it's like to be human. I suspect that most of us, and I certainly do, long for another person who will love us, everything about us, and especially when we mess up or feel we can't cope, and who will always be there to share our burdens and support us. A later Carmelite saint, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was around the end of the 19th century, put that longing into a poem addressed to Jesus, part of which reads, I need a heart burning with tenderness to be my support forever, to love everything in me, even my weakness, and never to leave me day or night. I must have a God who takes on my nature and becomes my brother and is able to suffer. I never used to be entirely convinced of the value of self-help groups where fellow sufferers met together, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say I thought they weren't for me. I learned differently when I ended up after a period of depression, in group therapy with fellow sufferers. I found there that I didn't need to explain myself in the way I usually had to others. I was with people who spoke the same language as me, and it was a huge relief. We were very different, but we shared an experience of weakness, and it gave us a sense of compassion for and solidarity with one another. It's something of that I think Saint Therese is talking about in her poem. And when she reads the Gospels to learn more about Jesus, she discovers there one who is weak, needy, tired, thirsty, in pain, and above all, in need of love. Someone whom she knows can relate to her fully in all the messiness and pain of daily living, and who walks by her side just as she can with him. This Jesus, God choosing to become weak and of no account, entrusting himself to us in that weakness because he longs to share his life and love with us, inspired Therese's passionate devotion and tenderness, and helped her to see the mystery of God's own love and tenderness, hidden and revealed in human weakness. And this in its turn can give us confidence in sharing our own weakness with God. Shortly after she entered her Carmelite community, Therese's beloved father became mentally ill, and this occasioned gossip that it was the loss of his beloved youngest daughter which had tipped him over the edge. His plight caused her great anguish, not diminished when she learned that while ill he had taken to wearing a veil over his face to hide his humiliation and sense of shame. At the time, there was a strand of popular devotion to the holy face of Jesus in the Passion, one that had previously held no appeal for Therese until her father fell ill. She had often spoken of her father as an image of God's love, and now she found a point of connection between the veiled face of her father in all his distress and humiliation and what we read of in Isaiah 53, the song of the suffering servant. You'll find that at the back if you want to pray with it later. In that we learn of the disfigured face of the servant revealing God's hidden love, and Therese felt it gave her a point of identity with God. It can also give us a context for our own sufferings and humiliations. The times, and they can be very painful times, when we feel our real self goes unrecognised by others, or else is spurned. Therese invites us to make a leap of faith and to trust that the God of love can be found, is found, even in our darkest hours. Unfortunately, she doesn't expect us to embrace our suffering and confusion bravely and cheerfully. Pointing to the fact that Jesus in his passion groaned, cried and fell repeatedly, too weak to carry his own cross, Therese, in a letter to her sister, suggests that we shouldn't expect or want to do any better. I expect we all know those times when we're suffering something and we think, well, if only I could do this generously and bravely, and be a brave sufferer. And we might find it an additional burden to be up against our weakness and find we just want to indulge in what a friend of mine calls a moan-a-thon. Therese exclaims, "Let us carry our crosses feebly. Let us suffer without courage. Jesus suffered in sadness. Would we still like to suffer generously and grandly? What an illusion. We'd never want to fall. What does it matter if I fall at each moment? I see my weakness through this, and this is great gain for me." This is an assertion that really cheers me up, that I don't have to be brave about my rotten life circumstances and carry my cross with a stiff upper lip, hoping that God will look kindly on how good I'm being about it all. But what about the last sentence of what I've just quoted from Therese? That our faults and weaknesses can be a cause of great gain. Therese offers infinite encouragement to those of us who frequently fall, or because of our personality or history, struggle with our emotions or ability to do things as we hope. Therese experienced all those things, but understood that they could be a means to draw us closer to God, if, and it's not always an easy if, however simple it may seem, we can use them to turn to God in trust and dependence. The fact of the matter is that the very things we think will please God can be a barrier to receiving his love, because they can encourage us to trust more in our own strength than God's. Therese, by contrast, was captivated by God's merciful love, and what she called her little way is all about confidence in God's mercy and his desire to give himself to us in love, and our response of surrender to that love. Her interpretation of the parable of the lost sheep is one that can help us all when we feel we've messed up. Therese suggests that because God loves nothing more than to love, our misery when we've gone wrong exerts a magnetic attraction for him, because it offers him a chance to love us even more. It also gives us a chance to affirm our trust in his love by turning to him in utter dependence, which also increases his joy. Our very poverty and failure can thus be a cause for gladness. Therese said that that's why it says in the parable of the lost sheep that there's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than over the 99 virtuous people who have no need of God's merciful love. It's when we go wrong, when we fail, that we know our real need of Jesus as Saviour, and that actually all we can offer him is our emptiness and need. Therese made of that a virtue. She said, "In the evening of my life, I shall come before God with empty hands." She recognised that if our hands are full of what we think of as our virtues, the number of old ladies we've helped cross the road or people we've visited in hospital, then we won't have hands that are open and empty to receive God's love. This for me takes the pressure off prayer. A lot of Carmelite teaching is devoted to not putting any value on how we feel or don't feel in prayer, not using our performance in prayer as an index as to whether or not we've prayed well. And this doesn't mean it's an anti-feelings type of spirituality. It's just saying that if prayer is all about God giving himself to us, then as long as we've come and done our best to be available and empty-handed when we come to pray, we can trust that God is working in us, no matter how much our prayer feels a washout or like we can't pray at all. A modern Carmelite authors put it like this: we might think that we fail all the time, that we can't pray, or that our hour of prayer seems perhaps a washout from start to finish. But we can tell ourselves it doesn't matter. The hour has been full of God because we have wanted to give God that time and receive from him all that he has to give. St. John of the Cross, another Carmelite saint, notes that the only way we can fail at prayer is by not attempting it. And it isn't a sort of attitude that gives up. On the way here I was thinking about the fact that I've given up on making Lenten resolutions on the whole, because I know I will always have broken them by the first Thursday of Lent. And Therese isn't saying that we lean back and sort of give up and say, well, I'm just like that, God puts up with me anyway and loves me. It's not a case, it's more a case of saying, yeah, I've gone wrong by Thursday, but I'm coming back to God and saying, yeah, I've messed up, but I'm trying again. I know that only you, your grace, can give me what I need. And finally, a bit of advice from the poets again, really. The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was no stranger to suffering of all kinds, emotional, psychological, spiritual, offers this advice to himself and us at times when we feel in despair and dryness and prayer seems impossible. He says, "My own heart, let me have more pity on. Let me live to my sad self hereafter kind, charitable, not live this tormented mind, tormenting yet. Soul, self, come, poor Jack self, I do advise you, jaded, let be. Call off thoughts a while elsewhere. Leave comfort, root room." Sometimes we just have to accept that we can't pray and all we can do is go out for a walk and maybe just take ourselves out of ourselves, because the danger can be that when we're worrying about not being able to pray, we've taken our eyes off God really, and we've got ourselves into a kind of circle of going round and round, wondering how to do better. Sometimes we just need to go outside, look at a tree or a leaf, anything. We just need to shake ourselves down and accept that's all we can manage at the moment, and that's okay. And more than that, if we can welcome that and accept our current state and entrust it to God's love, to offer him our empty hands in trust, then we do the best we can. A famous spiritual director at the beginning of the last section, someone called Dom John Chapman, gave this advice to someone: simply accept the way along which God leads you. He will make it plain what he wants you to offer him. Trust in God. You are at each moment in touch with him through all the arrangements of his providence, and these include your own state and your feelings at the moment you are trying to unite yourself with him. Try to be absolutely at peace because you are satisfied with God as he is to you at this moment. And then he said something which always cheers me up, although it's quite difficult, and he knew that. He says, put up with yourself. It is very hard, but it really is a very perfect act of love to God. says to God, I know I'm this mess, but I know you love me anyway, and I'm accepting to be this mess and to come to you as I am. Chapman realised, as did Saint Therese, that we feel a lot more comfortable and can even hide behind our virtues and even our seeming success at prayer. If our hands are full of our merits and good deeds, they won't be empty to receive God's love. She often took to herself the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18, which we'll be praying with in a minute, so don't worry if you don't know it. The philosopher Kierkegaard expressed it well when he said, "The greatest Christian heresy is to believe that the opposite of sin is virtue. No, the opposite of sin is grace. God be merciful to me, a sinner." What pleases God, says Saint Therese, is to see me love my littleness and poverty. It is the blind hope I have in his mercy. This is my sole treasure. This is the treasure which supplies for all our miseries, weaknesses, relapses and infidelities, because by means of this humility and confidence we shall obtain the divine mercy. And with this at our disposal, how can our wretchedness and poverty discourage us? So that's probably far too much of me. Definitely time to pray. So, if you'd like to find a place that's comfortable for you, a place where you can feel physically comfortable, maybe shut your eyes and take yourself to where you are now, sitting on your chair, your bottom on the chair, your back supported by the back of the chair. Maybe follow your breathing. Follow your breath going in and out. Just notice where you are at this moment, how you're feeling. Just acknowledge that feeling. Might be that you're bored or confused, feeling fed up with me talking a lot and having to listen. Or maybe you found something that you're thinking about. Or maybe you just feel nothing. Just notice whatever you're feeling. And just put it to one side for a moment. Keep it with you, but listen to the words of Jesus alongside. This comes from Luke chapter 18. And it's a parable of Jesus, and it begins, "Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, 'In a certain city there was a judge who feared neither God nor respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord says, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will God not grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Just going to have about 10 minutes of silent prayer now. You might want to go back to that word in the Gospel, or to look at one of the pictures if that helps you to focus. It includes the pictures along the front, a picture of the father welcoming home the prodigal son. And if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that the prodigal son, when he's come back to his father, still got an empty bottle or possibly a half full bottle in his pocket. He hasn't had to come back having given up drink or being bad. God happily receives him in the form of the father just as he is. Perhaps there's something in our lives that we've been trying to hide from, some difficulty or suffering, or it might just be that we're very fed up with ourselves at the moment. It might be worth thinking about the God who loves us and longs for us to return to him. Or spending time just looking at him, looking at us with a gaze of infinite love and compassion as we sit before him with our open, empty hands. Just finish this time of prayer with a prayer which was written by another Carmelite writer known to us as Edith Stein, or Sister Teresa Benedicta of Jesus. And she writes, Lord, I look back over the day, over my life, and see how fragmentary everything has been, and how much I planned that has gone undone, and all the reasons I have to be embarrassed and ashamed. I take everything exactly as it is, put it in your hands, and leave it with you. Now I can rest in you, really rest, and start the next moment as a new life.
Said or about anything that it's brought up, any questions it's brought up in you that you Nicola might have some wisdom to share with us about.
mentions the writings. I wondered if you'd left suggest a book list at the back, or
I haven't left a book list, but I can certainly send one to Father Bruce on some of the handouts and some of the quotations. I can certainly send some more.
I'd just like to say thank you for how much I identified with what you were saying. And what I really liked was, because I had a similar upbringing to you, I suppose, and I came through an atheistic family to God sort of rather indirectly in my late teens. And I fell in love with God, and I think at that point, when you first, it's a bit like a first love, I suppose. I think it only comes once, that intensity and that passion. And I think we're always yearning, if you like, for a repeat of that experience. And I think what today's given me, I don't think I'm going to get that back, because I know I'm never going to be 18 again. But I think it's the difference. It's if you like, the quietness and the sort of the acceptance of that love. And even if you don't feel quite the same way, it's still there for you. And I feel a sort of coming back. I feel a full circle almost.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing.
Just wanted to offer a little reflection of something that's happened to me recently. I very much identified with what you said about how what happens in the time of prayer is not important. In a sense, it's just coming with empty hands and giving the time to God. And for a long time when I heard that message, I used to get very frustrated with it, because I kind of felt, well, I always find myself failing to turn up for the time of prayer. So how am I supposed to even get the benefit of the time of giving myself to God if I'm not even kind of virtuous enough to turn up? And then just recently, as I was thinking about what I was going to do for Lent, I kind of turned that around in a sense with God, and used that sense of like, God, you know and I know that I can't turn up. And if I'm going to turn up, it's only because you give me the grace to do it. And that's just made it so much easier to turn up. For those of you who, like me, find it very difficult even to turn up for prayer, there's something in just offering that lack of ability to turn up to God and say, here I am, this is what I find difficult to do. And for the moment, at least, it seems that it's made it much easier.
Yes, I noticed when I was preparing this talk that despite everything I said, I was, trying hard to do it myself, as it were. Eventually, in the early hours of the morning, I had to say to God, I give up. You're going to have to tell me what to say. Blood if I know. And when I don't even bother to make a Lenten resolution because I know it's going to be nixed by Thursday, that's kind of reverse of what you're talking about, really, Ben. It's not even saying, what can you expect? It's, me imagining that I might have managed to do something, but you've shared a really important truth for us, I think, that when we're honest about what we can't do and hand it over to God, God can do surprising things.
Are we failing if we fail to give up something for Lent?
Oh, not at all. No. I mean, rejoice if you can. I would
Give
say.
anything up for Lent.
No. Well, yes. I'll tell you a little story. When I was a nun, on Easter morning we used to share our breakfast with visitors to the community, and I was sharing breakfast with a group of keen visitors who were all sharing what they'd given up for Lent, or what they were doing extra for Lent, and then I got asked the dreaded question, "Oh, sister, what have you done for Lent?" And I said, kind of in a throwaway line kind of way, although it was absolutely true, I said, "I've given up trying," you know. And they tittered appreciatively, thinking, "Oh well, she probably hasn't." But actually there's a lot of truth in that. When we just say, actually I realise I can't even try and pick something up. But that's, you know, and we offer that to God, our weakness. God's perfectly happy with that, because it's us being honest about where we are and looking to him and saying, yeah, it's over to you, God. You know, God's more interested in our love than our virtue, really. Yeah. I comfort myself, that's. And actually giving up trying is sometimes what some of us need to do, you know. I'm a big trier, and sometimes we just have to give up on trying and let God do the work, I think.
For a long while, the subject of darkness always troubled me. But several years ago, I came to the realisation that it's in the darkness I found God. Because if you strip away everything else, when there's nothing else left, it's just God. So I found more comfort now in darkness.
Thank you. Yes, in one of the handouts at the back, there's a quotation from the modern Carmelite author Ruth Burrows that I've mentioned. And she notes that in John's Gospel, Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth and the life," just before his passion. And shortly after that, we see Jesus, you know, struggling under the weight of the cross, groaning, crying. And he's still the way, the truth and the life at that moment, you know. And we can forget that, you know. We imagine it might be different for us. You know. And I should add that, you know, what I say may not be relevant to everyone, and if you have blessed and good prayer times, then rejoice and give thanks to God, because they're fine too. I think it's just that I'm somebody who tends to struggle and fail, but I've shared this experience with you.
I think our times, it's a time of struggle, maybe depression or breakdown, is actually breakthrough, because it can so often become a time of growth.
Yeah.
Very deep.
Yeah, thank you, Pam.
I think one of the things that's very refreshing in the reasons I invited Nicola, because I knew that she would speak well about this subject, is we currently live in a church, and by that I mean broadly in a church which is really struggling to be confident, and because I think a lot of what the church used to be isn't how it's going to be in the future. You know, with large institutions and you know, which we as a church have experienced very closely, the whole struggle about finances and keeping things going and all that. And the church is experiencing that at large in nearly every place. And I think that that's a sign that God's inviting us into a whole new way of being the church in the future. In 50 and 100 years' time, I think it's likely that the church will look very different from how it does now in terms of how things are done and where priests work and all that kind of thing. But I think how the church is dealing with that is the way that human beings tend to deal with that they kind of create this success culture, and that actually churches have to be successful, and that as Christians we have to be successful. And I think that can be very overwhelming. And I think there are a lot of people who don't think that the church has got anything to say to them because they don't think they're successful enough to be part of the church. And I think that's a real problem that we have. And I think as the church probably out of the place of darkness, that newness will come. But no doubt that will be challenging and will be a struggle. But do you notice that about the church and success? I mean, you're part of, aren't you, a very well-known church, as Cable Street, and you know, struggles like lots of churches struggle in that immensely diverse community, and sort of overshadowed by success stories all around.
Yes, I was just thinking, looking at all of you, you know, the number of people here comprises more than the average Sunday congregation at my church. I mean, if we hit 20, we're feeling reasonably full. It is hard, but, you know, the Jesus of the Gospels came to save sinners and not the success types, really, and that gives me comfort in the middle of that. You know, I live in an area of great material deprivation and poverty, as well as everything else, and Christianity is by no means the majority religion. I live in an area where Islam is very much the majority religion, and that's fine, but it does mean that the church doesn't look very successful, and our own particular church is highly unsuccessful in terms of numbers, and yet in terms of love and attracting people who don't fit in anywhere else, it does well, I think. And we actually use our church hall to support a number of a community of people with mental health problems and a credit union and a children's project, but and it's very easy for us to take refuge in those things and say, well, actually we're not quite as unsuccessful as we look, but it's very much by the very nature of our poverty in all ways, it's needed to become a virtue, really.
Thank you very much indeed for coming. Nicola, thank you so much for your preparation. You've clearly prepared this extremely well, and spent a lot of time on it. And thank you for bringing your resources with you. And there are some things on the table, as you said.